He had no money, no parents, and no future. By the time he was 5 years old, Charlie Chaplin had already been abandoned by the world. What he did next changed the history of cinema forever. He made the whole world laugh while his own life was falling apart. Charlie Chaplin was a genius, a survivor, and one of the most controversial figures Hollywood ever produced. This is his story. Welcome back to Echo Mind Documentaries. If this is your first time here, subscribe, like, share, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Let's dive back into the topic. In the winter of 1889, a boy was born into a world that had no place for him. Charles Spencer Chaplin came into life in the East End of London, a place defined by poverty, overcrowded tenements, and the daily struggle simply to survive. His parents were music hall performers, both of them chasing a life on the stage, but the glamour of that world was a lie. Behind the curtains, there was drinking, instability, and a home slowly falling to pieces. His father, Charles Chaplin Sr., was a tenor and an actor of modest talent. More than anything, he was a drinker. By the time Charlie was 3 years old, his parents had separated. His father drifted further into alcoholism and would be largely absent for the rest of his short life. His mother, Hannah Hall, was the one who held what remained of the family together. She performed under the name Lily Harley, and she had genuine talent, but talent alone could not pay the rent in Victorian London, and the rent was always due. Charlie and his older half-brother Sidney watched their mother fight to keep them fed. There were weeks of near starvation. There were nights in workhouses. The workhouse was not a shelter, it was a humiliation, a place where the poor surrendered their dignity in exchange for a bed and a bowl of broth. Children were separated from their parents. Rules were enforced with cruelty. Charlie Chaplin would carry the memory of those places inside him for the rest of his life, and it would fuel every frame of film he ever made. When Charlie was around 7 years old, his mother suffered a breakdown on stage. She lost her voice mid-performance, and the audience began to laugh. The theater manager, desperate to keep the show alive, pushed young Charlie out onto the stage in her place. The boy who had watched his mother perform hundreds of times stepped into the spotlight and sang. He sang a popular song of the day, and then, when coins began raining down onto the stage, he stopped and announced he would collect the money first before he continued. The audience erupted. The instinct was already there. The showman had arrived. Hannah's mental health deteriorated. She was admitted to Cane Hill Lunatic Asylum, and Charlie and Sidney were sent to the Central London District School for Paupers. The school was harsh, the conditions were bleak, and the humiliation of poverty was woven into every day. But Charlie was watching everything. He was storing it all: the cruelty, the comedy, the desperate humans trying to hold on to whatever dignity they had left. He was learning the raw material of his art from life itself. He joined a traveling troupe called the 8 Lancashire Lads at the age of 9. He toured the music hall circuit, performing clog dancing and comedy routines for working-class audiences across England. It was exhausting, often cold and poorly paid, but it was the stage. And on the stage, Charlie Chaplin was never poor. On the stage, he was someone. By his early teens, he had found work as a child actor in London theater productions. He played Billy the Page Boy in Sherlock Holmes, a role he performed for years across multiple touring productions. He was developing discipline, timing, and the kind of physical precision that would later define his entire cinematic identity. He was also watching the great performers of his generation, absorbing technique the way other children absorbed schooling. At 17, he joined the Fred Carnot comedy troupe, and this is where everything changed. Carnot was a master of physical comedy and mime. His troupe toured England and eventually took their shows to America. Charlie became one of Carnot's leading performers, a talent so undeniable that audiences would watch him and forget everyone else on stage. He had a gift for silence. In an era before amplified sound, he could hold an entire theater with nothing but movement and expression. It was during a Carnot tour of the United States in 1912 that a talent scout from Keystone Film Company spotted him. Max Sennett, the head of Keystone, was building a new kind of entertainment. He offered Charlie a contract. The pay was more than Charlie had ever seen in his life. He arrived at Keystone Studios in 1913, unsure of what he was walking into. The early silent film industry was chaotic, fast-moving, and creatively wild. Senate's operation ran on energy and improvisation. Charlie made his first film, Making a Living, in 1914. He hated it. He felt the director had misunderstood him completely. But on his second film, a short called Kid Auto Races at Venice, something happened that would alter the entire course of cinema. Needing a costume for a comedic character, Charlie went to the wardrobe department and began putting things together. He chose a pair of pants that were far too big, a coat that was far too small, oversized shoes worn on the wrong feet, a tiny derby hat, a bamboo cane, and a small toothbrush mustache. He walked onto the set, and the Little Tramp was born. The character was an immediate sensation. There was something in him that connected to everyone who watched him. He was poor but dignified. He was ridiculous but romantic. He faced every humiliation the world could throw at him, and somehow, impossibly, he kept going. He was funny in the way that real pain is sometimes funny, because there is nothing else to do but laugh. Audiences who had never had money, never had power, never had respect, saw themselves in the Little Tramp. He was the underdog of the world, and the world loved him for it. Chaplin moved quickly. He left Keystone for S&A Films in 1915, and then for Mutual Film Corporation in 1916, each time negotiating better terms, more creative control, and more money. At Mutual, he made 12 films in 2 years that are still considered among the finest short comedies ever produced. The Immigrant, One in the Morning, Easy Street, each one built on the last. Each one pushed the Tramp deeper, more complex, more human. He was now the most recognizable human being on Earth. In the years before radio and television, before the internet and smartphones, Chaplin's fame had spread across the globe through nothing but film prints shipped from country to country. He was mobbed in the streets of London. He was followed through the streets of New York, and countries where people could not read English, where they had never heard his voice. They knew his walk, his hat, his cane. He had somehow created a universal language. In 1919, Chaplin co-founded United Artists alongside Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks, and D.W. Griffith. It was a revolutionary act. Hollywood studios controlled their stars. United Artists flipped the equation, putting creative power into the hands of the performers themselves. Chaplin now had complete control over every film he made. He used that freedom to create The Kid in 1921. It was his first feature-length film, and it was a departure from everything audiences expected. The film starred a 6-year-old boy named Jackie Coogan alongside the Tramp, and it was not purely a comedy. It was a story about poverty, about the bond between a man who had nothing and a child who had even less. Audiences wept. They had come to laugh, and they left with something they had not anticipated. Chaplin had shown them that comedy and grief were not opposites. They were the same thing, experienced from different angles. The Gold Rush followed in 1925, The Circus in 1928, City Lights in 1931, Modern Times in 1936. Each film was a masterwork. Each one was his own, written, directed, produced, scored, and starring Charlie Chaplin alone. He was a one-man film industry operating at the highest level of art that cinema had yet produced. But the world was changing around him, and Chaplin was refusing to change with it. By 1929, synchronized sound had transformed Hollywood. Audiences expected to hear actors speak. Every major studio had converted to sound production. Chaplin resisted. He understood something that the industry seemed to miss. The Tramp could not have a voice. The moment he spoke, the universality would collapse. He would belong to one language, one place, one people. In silence, he belonged to everyone. He made City Lights as a silent film in 1931, years after the industry had moved on. Critics expected it to fail. Audiences came anyway. The film ends with one of the most emotionally devastating sequences in cinema history. The Tramp, who has sacrificed everything so that a blind flower girl could have an operation to restore her sight, meets her again after she has recovered and becomes successful. She does not know what he looks like. She knows only his hands. She takes his hand in a moment of careless kindness and then realizes who he is. She sees him, ragged and broken and smiling. He looks at her and asks with his eyes if she is happy. She says she is. He smiles back. The screen goes dark. Audiences in 1931 sat in silence for a long moment before they could applaud.
The 1930s were also years of personal turbulence that Chaplin could never quite outrun. His marriages were numerous and often scandalous by the standards of the time. He married Mildred Harris when she was 17 and he was 29, then Leda Gray when she was 16 and he was 35. The divorce from Gray became a tabloid catastrophe with accusations that tore through his public image. The American press, which had adored him, began to turn. There were also political suspicions gathering around him. Chaplin had never applied for American citizenship despite living in the country for nearly decades. He had been born in Britain and he remained a British subject by choice. In an era of rising American nationalism and Cold War anxiety, that choice made him a target. He was associated by critics and government investigators with left-wing politics, though he himself resisted any simple political label. What he believed in, consistently and loudly, was the dignity of ordinary people and the corruption of unchecked power. He said it most directly in The Great Dictator, released in 1940. It was his first true sound film, and it was an act of extraordinary courage. At a time when America was officially neutral on the war in Europe and many in Hollywood were actively avoiding any provocation of Nazi Germany, Chaplin made a direct and savage satire of Adolf Hitler. He played two roles, a Jewish barber and a dictator named Adenoid Hinkle. The film was a comedy and a warning, and a howl of fury all at once. At the end of the film, the barber, mistaken for the dictator, is pushed to a podium and expected to give a speech celebrating fascism. Instead, he speaks directly to the camera, directly to the audience, directly to the world. He pleads for kindness. He speaks about the distance between the technology of humanity and the humanity of its people. He says that in the name of democracy, let us use that power. Let us all unite. It remains one of the most unusual and affecting moments in film history. A comedian who had spent 40 years hiding behind mime and music, suddenly speaking, and what he said mattered. The American government did not thank him for it. The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover had been compiling a file on Chaplin for years. His association with progressive causes, his refusal to become an American citizen, his personal life, all of it was cataloged and held. When he traveled to London in 1952 for the premiere of his film Limelight, the United States Attorney General revoked his re-entry permit. Chaplin was informed while still at sea that he would not be allowed to return to the country where he had lived for nearly 40 decades, where he had built his entire career, where he had become one of the most celebrated artists in.
He chose not to fight it. He settled in Switzerland with his final wife, Una O'Neill, the daughter of playwright Eugene O'Neill. Una was 36 years his junior, and by all accounts, their marriage was genuinely happy, perhaps the only peace of that kind Chaplin had ever truly known. They had 8 children together. He lived at the Villa Manoir de Bonn near Vevey, and there he found something close to contentment. He continued to write. He published his autobiography in 1964, a dense and vivid account of a life so extraordinary it read like fiction. He made 2 more films in Europe, A King in New York in 1957 and A Countess from Hong Kong in 1967, though neither reached the heights of his earlier work. He was an old man now, and the world had moved on to different kinds of stories. But the world had not forgotten him. In 1972, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences invited Charlie Chaplin back to the United States to receive an honorary Academy Award. He accepted. When he walked onto the stage of the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion in Los Angeles, the audience gave him a 12-minute standing ovation. 12 minutes. He stood there with his cane, older now, moved by it, and the crowd simply would not stop. He returned to Switzerland and died there on Christmas morning 1977. He was 88 years old. A few months later, in an incident that speaks to the peculiar madness his legacy could still generate, his body was stolen from its grave by a pair of Eastern European mechanics who attempted to ransom it back to his widow. Una refused to negotiate. The thieves were caught. Chaplin's body was recovered and reburied, this time under concrete. Even in death, the world could not quite leave him alone. What he left behind is not easily measured. He made over 80 films. He pioneered techniques of physical comedy that still defined the grammar of screen performance. He proved that silence could be a language, that poverty could be poetic, that laughter was not the opposite of seriousness, but its most honest expression.
He built an empire with his body, his face, his walk, and his refusal to accept that the world as it was represented the world as it had to be. The little tramp had nothing. He was forever broke, forever hungry, forever on the outside of every room that mattered. And yet he walked through every frame of every film with his hat tilted and his cane spinning and his eyes full of something the wealthy and the powerful never quite managed to manufacture. He walked through all of it with dignity.